Cole Hargrove ordered a bride with the same cold logic he used to buy a new saddle. It was a practical decision, empty of sentiment, and he filled out the agency paperwork at his kitchen table using the same stiff handwriting he used for livestock invoices. When the confirmation letter finally arrived, he simply filed it away between a feed receipt and a property tax notice. What stepped off the train at Dust Creek Station 3 weeks later was not the woman he had filed for. She stood on the platform in a dark kimono, as composed as still water, with a lacquered wooden case strapped across her back. The case was longer than her arm and narrower than a rifle, wrapped tightly in cloth the color of dried blood. When Cole asked what she was carrying, she looked at him for a long moment before she gave her answer. "Nothing that concerns you yet." 3 weeks after that conversation, 6 men rode onto his land before the sun was even up, and Cole would be on his knees in the dirt before he truly understood what she meant. The sun hammered down on Dust Creek Station like a punishment, turning the platform boards a bleached white and making the air shimmer as if it were bending under the heat. Cole stood with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed while Denny Marsh waited a half step behind him, and both men watched the train exhale its last heavy cloud of steam. The agency letter sat in Cole's pocket, and he had read it so many times that the fold lines had turned soft against his leg. The paper described a woman of good temperament and modest manner who was willing to adapt to the harsh conditions of the frontier. He had pictured someone small and perhaps a bit tired, a woman who would look at his ranch and feel a sense of relief to finally have 4 walls around her. Riko was the last person to step off the train. She was neither small nor tired, and she descended the steps without even touching the handrail. Her dark eyes moved across the platform the way a man's eyes move when he walks into a room he doesn't trust, showing no sign of nerves as she simply read the space. Her kimono was a plain, travel-worn dark blue, but it was perfectly clean, and the lacquered case rode across her back on a cloth strap she had knotted herself. It sat against her spine like it had always been a part of her. Men on the platform stopped to stare, but she didn't drop her eyes for any of them. Denny leaned toward Cole and spoke low enough that he assumed she couldn't hear, asking if Cole was sure he hadn't ordered a Chinese bride by mistake. Cole didn't bother to correct him because he told himself the argument wasn't worth his time, but the truth was that he simply didn't know what to say. Riko gave no sign that she had heard the comment as she walked toward Cole and stopped 2 feet away. "You are Mr. Hargrove." It wasn't a question, but he said yes anyway. The ride back to the ranch covered 6 miles of dust and scrubland and took nearly an hour to complete. Cole tried to talk, pointing out the fence lines and the creek bed and the direction of the nearest town, but Riko sat beside him on the wagon bench and said almost nothing. Her eyes never rested, and she watched the landscape the way a person watches something they know they will need to remember later. She noted every ridge, every gap in the tree line, and every spot where the road bent close to the cover of the brush. Cole noticed her intensity, but he chose not to mention it. Once they reached the ranch, he walked her through the house to show her the kitchen and the pantry and the cast-iron stove. He pointed out the water barrel inside the back door and showed her the small room off the kitchen with a window facing the yard. She listened to him without asking a single question until he finished his tour and started back toward the door. "Where is the well?" He turned around, confused by the sudden interest. "The well?" "Yes, where is it positioned?" He pointed north past the barn, and she nodded slowly as if she were placing the location on a map she was building in her head. She didn't care about the stove or the pantry, but she needed to know exactly where the well sat. Cole stood there for a moment and realized he couldn't think of one useful thing to say, so he told her supper was at 6 and left her to settle in. That night he sat on the porch and listened to the sound of her moving through the house with quiet and deliberate steps. He had the distinct and unsettling feeling that she wasn't just moving in, she was learning the place. He had seen her slide the lacquered case under her bed through the open doorway, but he decided to let it go for now. She was already moving by the time Cole woke up. He heard her before he saw her, catching the soft creak of the back door, followed by a silence that felt heavy. He pulled on his boots and walked over to the kitchen window to find her out in the yard during the gray pre-dawn. She was moving through a slow and deliberate sequence of positions, her arms extended and her weight shifting as she placed one foot precisely in front of the other. There was no hurry and no wasted motion in her steps, and she had been at it long enough that her breath was already a faint cloud in the cold morning air. Cole stood at the window for a full minute before he could even decide what he was looking at. Then he put the coffee on and pretended he hadn't seen a thing. Breakfast was rice, cooked soft, with pickled vegetables on the side, and something fermented that smelled sharp enough to clear a man's sinuses. Cole sat down and looked at the bowl. Then he ate it without saying a word because he hadn't had a meal since noon yesterday, and hunger settled the argument fast. It actually tasted good, which bothered him more than the smell did. Denny wandered in, hoping for eggs, but took one look at his bowl and ate standing up by the door like he might need to leave in a hurry. Riko ate in total silence and cleared the table before either of them had even finished their coffee. The trip to town happened 2 days later because Cole needed flour, lamp oil, and a new axle pin for the wagon. He brought Riko along because it seemed like the right thing to do, though he couldn't have explained his reasoning if someone had asked. Walt Gruber ran the general store and knew everyone's business without making any effort to hide it. He looked at Riko the way he would look at a piece of freight delivered to the wrong address. Then he spoke to Cole about her, like she wasn't standing 3 feet away. "She speak English?" Gruber asked. "Well enough," Cole said. Gruber just nodded and went back to tallying the order without speaking to her directly a single time. When she reached past him to check a bolt of cloth, he stepped aside as if she were reaching for something that didn't belong to her. Cole paid the bill and kept his mouth shut, telling himself it wasn't his fight to pick while he was in another man's store. On the walk back to the wagon, Sheriff Lyle Boone caught them near the livery. Boone was a wide man who moved slowly on purpose to let you know he was never in a hurry because he didn't have to be. He tipped his hat to Cole and glanced once at Riko before looking back at Cole and staying there. "Cutter Gang has been running the ranches down south of the ridge," Boone said, "and they are asking for monthly considerations." He let that sit for a moment while he watched Cole's reaction. "A couple of outfits paid up, but one didn't, and I just figured you ought to know about it." Cole told the sheriff he appreciated the warning and said they would be fine. Boone said sure and went on his way. On the ride back, Riko waited until the town was completely out of sight before she spoke. She didn't look at him when she asked how many men were in this gang. "Don't know exactly," Cole replied. "Have they killed anyone?" she asked. Cole kept his eyes fixed on the road and told her not to worry about it. She didn't answer him, but she went quiet in a way that felt like she was disagreeing with him and had simply chosen not to say it out loud. He liked that silence even less than if she had started an argument. That evening he found her out in the barn with her hands moving along the top rail of the fence. She was testing where the wood had gone soft and pressing each gate hinge with her thumb to check the pin. She was methodical as she moved from corner to corner. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look up from her work and said she was learning what holds and what doesn't. He went back inside with those words sitting in his chest like a stone. Cole finally asked about the case on a Thursday evening after the supper dishes were done and the lamp was burning low. There was no reasonable excuse left to avoid the topic he had been circling for 3 days. He didn't ask gently, but instead pulled out a chair and sat down across the table from her to say he needed to know what was in that case. Riko looked at him for a long moment before she sat down too, which surprised him more than any answer would have. He had expected her to push back or deflect the question, but what he got was a long and considered pause before she started talking. Her father's name was Kenji, and he had been a samurai in Satsuma province in southern Japan. He was a man who built his entire life inside the code called Bushido, which Riko explained was not a philosophy to him, but something as deep as bone. It meant honor was placed above survival, above comfort, and even above the feelings of a daughter who wanted him to stop sharpening a sword and eat his dinner. She said all of this without any bitterness, stating it as a simple fact of who he was. She understood that code before she understood much else about the world. What she couldn't have known as a child was how fast a world built on that kind of certainty could be taken apart. In 1868, the Meiji government came to power and set about dismantling the old Japan piece by piece. The samurai class was abolished, and men who had spent their whole lives in service to a lord and a code were suddenly handed a government stipend and told to become farmers or merchants. Kenji did not take any of it quietly. He spent years arguing and petitioning while he watched his rank and income stripped away layer by layer until there was nothing left to take except the blade itself. By 1877, he had joined the Satsuma Rebellion, which was a last uprising of samurai who refused to disappear. They lost the fight when the government crushed them inside 6 months, and the men who led the rebellion were branded as traitors. Kenji came home alive, which was almost worse than dying on the field. The family land was gone, and the family name was ruined, meaning everything Bushido was supposed to protect had been taken in spite of his loyalty. Riko was 17 when that rebellion ended, and she watched her father train every morning in the yard of a house that no longer belonged to them. He went through the forms alone because those movements were all he had left, and he wasn't practicing for a battle anymore. He was just refusing to stop. He died 4 years later, not from a wound, but from a combination of shame and sickness that had been eating him since the day he walked home from a war he lost for reasons that had nothing to do with courage. He left her the katana and gave her one instruction during the week before he died while she was sitting beside him. He told her to carry the blade, but never to carry the dishonor. She came to America because Japan had nothing left for the daughter of a man the government had labeled a traitor. The agency advertisement was in a newspaper someone had left at the port, and she read it twice before answering it that same day. She spent the weeks before the ship departed learning as much English as she could from a missionary's wife who charged her nothing and asked for nothing in return. "So you're not here because you wanted a husband," Cole said. Riko tilted her head slightly, the same way she did when she was deciding whether a question deserved a straight answer. She asked him if he was here because he wanted a wife. He didn't answer her because the honest answer was no. He was here because the ranch was falling apart, and grief had used up 3 years of his life, so he needed someone to help hold the place together. He had wanted a function rather than a person, and the truth was that they both had. The lamp threw a soft light across the table between them while they sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, the quiet between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like the start of something honest. The riders appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 shapes emerging from the southern heat haze at a pace that signaled they had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. Cole spotted the rising dust long before the horses came into view, so he was already standing on the porch by the time they pulled up to his fence line. The man leading the group had a jaw that looked like it had been shattered and put back together by someone who didn't care about the results, leaving a jagged scar that ran from his ear down to his chin. His face was a map of old violence that had long ago stopped showing any human emotion, and he sat loose in his saddle with one hand resting casually on the horn, smiling with the kind of cold confidence that makes a man realize the smile itself is the threat. "You Cole Hargrove?" he asked. "Who's asking?" "Name's Rook," he said, speaking the name as if it were a title Cole should have recognized immediately. "We represent an organization that looks after the ranching operations in this territory, making sure the water keeps running and the trouble stays far away." He let his eyes wander across the yard with the slow, heavy satisfaction of a man appraising property he already considered his own, and then he added that $50 a month was the price, due on the first of every month in cash or silver. Cole didn't hesitate before telling him no. Rook simply nodded as if he had expected that answer, or perhaps even preferred it because it made the next part of his job more interesting. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse around without saying another word, his two companions falling into line behind him as they started back down the road. There were no raised voices and no specific threats that Cole could ever repeat in a court of law, yet that lingering smile remained on Rook's face as he rode away, which felt far more dangerous than any insult he could have shouted. Cole sent a rider toward town that same afternoon carrying a desperate letter for Sheriff Boone, and the reply arrived the next morning on a single sheet of paper covered in rushed, messy handwriting. The note explained there had been a stage robbery near Las Cruces that left 2 deputies tied up, which meant the sheriff couldn't ride out for at least 2 days. "Sit tight," the letter said. 2 days felt like a lifetime. Cole and Denny spent the rest of the afternoon dragging heavy boxes of ammunition out from the back of the pantry to load both rifles and the spare shotgun. They spent the remaining daylight nailing thick boards across the 2 south-facing windows where the angle from the road left the glass completely exposed to gunfire. And while the work went fast enough, it never felt like it would actually be enough to matter when the time finally came. Riko handled the preparations on the other side of the house with a quiet, mechanical efficiency that made Cole's own movements feel clumsy. She had watched him struggle with the first board before she simply took the hammer from the peg by the door and started on the east-facing shutters herself, moving much faster than Cole did, with no wasted motion and every single nail driven clean and straight into the wood. Denny watched her work for a long moment and wisely chose to say nothing, which was probably the smartest thing the young man had done all week. Cole found her after the sun went down and told her plainly that when the trouble started, she needed to stay inside and keep herself far away from the windows. She looked at him with the same detached expression she'd used on the storekeeper in town, showing neither anger nor fear, but rather a cold way of measuring the man standing in front of her. She didn't bother to argue with him. She just turned back toward the dark yard and let the heavy silence of the plains answer for her. That night, Cole lay awake in the stifling heat and listened to the sounds of the house settling in the dark. Sometime after midnight, he heard a soft noise coming from her room that sounded like heavy cloth being pulled back and something being unwrapped with extreme care. And though he stood up and walked to her door, holding his hand just an inch away from the wood for a long minute, he eventually turned around and went back to his bed without knocking. The ranch felt smaller and more fragile in the darkness. 2 days was a very long time to wait for a fight you knew was coming. It wasn't a noise that woke him, but rather the sudden and complete absence of sound. The crickets had gone silent. The wind had stopped moving through the scrub grass outside his window, and even the horses in the corral had stopped shifting their weight. Cole had lived on this patch of land long enough to recognize the rhythm of its breathing, and right now the land was holding its breath. He sat up in the dark. The sky outside was just beginning to shift from a deep black to that bruised gray color that shows up an hour before the sun actually breaks the horizon. He reached for his boots and heard Riko's door open on the other side of the wall without a single creak of the hinges, and he could tell by the deliberate weight of her steps that she hadn't just woken up, but had been sitting in the dark waiting for this exact moment. He grabbed his rifle from the corner by the door. The riders hit the ranch from 3 different directions at once, a tactic that told Cole immediately that these men had done this to other families before. 6 men moved fast and low in their saddles, fanning out before they even reached the front gate so there wouldn't be a single point for a defender to cover. 2 of them broke off toward the barn, while another 2 rode hard for the bunkhouse where Denny was still sleeping. And then Rook and 1 other man came straight for the main house, riding side by side down the center of the yard as if they were invited guests. Cole managed to get 1 shot off from the porch before they reached the steps, and he watched the leftmost rider go sideways off his horse and hit the dirt without moving again. But Rook's partner was already off his horse and moving toward the house, and before Cole could lever another round into the chamber, the man's arm swung back and sent a lit lantern crashing through the front window. The glass shattered in a spray of shards, and the curtains caught fire instantly, sending orange light climbing up the wall as thick smoke began to fill the room. A single gunshot rang out from the direction of the bunkhouse. Then he heard Denny's voice start to shout something before it was cut short. Cole moved toward the edge of the porch while trying to cover both the yard and the burning window behind him, but the distraction meant he wasn't covering either one of them properly. He could hear the men at the barn shouting to each other in short, clipped words that sounded organized and practiced, and the realization hit him that these weren't just desperate drifters looking for a payday, because they were executing a plan they had used many times before. Rook stepped up onto the porch with his pistol already drawn and leveled at Cole's chest. Cole tried to bring his rifle up, but Rook fired a single, deliberate shot that hit the wooden stock of the long gun and wrenched it sideways with enough force to tear it right out of Cole's grip. The vibration of the impact traveled from the wood straight into his bones, leaving his hands completely numb from the wrists down, and the rifle hit the porch boards with a hollow thud and skittered off the edge into the dirt. Cole's knees hit the wood a second later. It wasn't because a bullet had found him, but because his legs had simply suffered a mechanical failure once he realized he had run out of options. He sat there unarmed, with his hands useless, and smoke rolling out of the broken window behind him, watching Rook take 3 slow steps toward him with that same flat, terrifying smile on his face. Then the front door opened. Riko stepped out onto the porch. She had finally unwrapped the long case she had carried across the ocean, and the katana was held low in both of her hands. The polished steel caught the flickering orange light from the fire inside the house and threw it back into the yard as a thin, cold line of silver. Rook stopped walking. He had come to this ranch prepared to deal with a tired rancher and a scared hired hand, but his mind was now struggling to process what he was actually seeing. He looked at the woman, the strange, curved blade, and the absolute stillness of her posture. And in the few seconds it took him to think, Riko moved 2 steps to her left. She placed herself directly between Rook and Cole's kneeling body, taking the ground as if it had always belonged to her. She isn't showing any signs of fear. She isn't performing a version of being calm or trying to push her terror down deep inside, because the fear simply isn't there at all. Her hands are perfectly steady and her feet are planted firmly in the dust, looking like a woman who has lived this moment 1,000 times in a dirt yard in southern Japan. She is moving through the forms her father carved into her soul before she was even old enough to understand what they were meant for. And this porch and this dust are exactly what all those years of practice were leading toward. Rook looks down at the blade and then back up at her face. He isn't smiling anymore. She doesn't charge, and that is the first thing that completely throws Rook off his rhythm. He has faced men with knives before, and in his experience, men with knives always charge, because they close the distance in a panic of forward motion and desperation. Usually, you just step aside and let their own momentum finish the job. But Riko does not move toward him at all. She simply holds the ground she has already claimed with her blade held low and her weight settled deep into her back foot. She watches him the way a person watches a door they are waiting to see open. Rook's hand flies to his pistol in a smooth draw he has practiced 1,000 times, but the barrel is only halfway level when she covers the distance between them in 2 silent steps. Her left hand redirects his wrist outward while her right drives the butt of the katana's handle into the inside of his forearm. She hits him hard at the exact angle that forces a hand to open whether it wants to or not, and the pistol hits the dirt before he can even process what happened. The entire exchange takes about as long as it takes to blink twice. Rook stumbles back a step and stares at his own empty hand like it belongs to a stranger. The second man comes from Riko's right side off the porch rail, moving fast and low with a long knife already pulled. He is bigger than Rook and significantly angrier, which turns out to be his biggest problem because he comes in hot with all his weight committed forward. Riko pivots off her left foot to let him pass by her outside shoulder. Then her hip drops as she turns his own momentum against him. She uses his forward drive to send him crashing into the porch rail until the wood cracks and he falls into the dirt below. He doesn't come back up, but his knife stays behind on the boards. Shouting erupts from the yard as the 2 men by the barn realize the plan has gone sideways. They start moving toward the house at a full run with their guns up, but Riko does not retreat an inch. She takes 1 step back to the top of the porch stairs and holds that line like it was drawn in stone. Her breathing stays perfectly even and her arms do not shake. Cole is still on his knees, and as the feeling starts to return to his hands, he realizes for the first time that this isn't actually bravery. Bravery is when you are afraid but do it anyway. But Riko isn't afraid because she is simply doing what she was built to do. Cole's right hand finds Rook's pistol in the dirt beside him, and he manages to get his fingers around it as he struggles to one knee. He raises the weapon toward the 2 men coming across the yard with a grip that is weak and half numb, but the gun is pointed at them, and that is enough to make them hesitate. They slow down, and then they stop. Riko has the tip of her katana pressed against Rook's throat while he stands perfectly still. He looks down the length of the steel at the woman holding it, and his face takes on an expression Cole has never seen on a man before. It isn't exactly fear, but rather the sudden recognition that the world contains things he was never prepared for, and one of those things is standing 4 feet in front of him. "What are you?" he asks, and the question comes out quiet, like he actually needs to know the answer. Riko doesn't answer him right away, letting the question hang in the cold dawn air for a moment, just like her father used to let silence do its work before he spoke. "My father's daughter," she finally says. The men from the barn drop their guns into the dirt, and one of them raises his hands before Cole even has to ask. The other looks at Rook for an order that never comes, so he eventually raises his hands too. The whole thing took 4 minutes. Cole would count them back later while trying to make sense of the shape of the morning, realizing it took only 4 minutes to go from Rook's first step on the porch to 5 men standing or lying defeated in the dirt. He looks at her directly, the way you look at something you've been glancing at sideways for weeks and are finally ready to face. She is lowering the blade now, though she isn't exactly relaxing, and she stays present while she continues to watch the yard. "You could have told me," he says. She considers his words for a second and says, "You wouldn't have believed me." He thinks about that for the length of 3 breaths and realizes she is right. Sheriff Boone rode onto the property at 9:30 in the morning with 2 deputies and a look on his face that suggested he had been rehearsing a speech for the last mile. Whatever he intended to say stopped cold when he saw the yard. Rook and 4 of his men were tied to the fence post along the south rail with their wrists and ankles bound by the same rope Cole used to hobble horses. The 5th man, the one Cole had knocked off his horse in the first 30 seconds of the fight, was sitting against the barn wall with a rag tied around his leg. He was breathing, but he wasn't going anywhere. Denny sat on the bunkhouse steps with his arm in a sling Riko had made from a kitchen towel, and with the color back in his face He was already telling the story to anyone who would listen. Cole sat on the porch rail with his bruised hands wrapped around a tin cup, while Riko stayed inside making tea. Boone's eyes scanned the yard twice before they finally settled on Cole. "You did all this?" Cole stayed quiet for a moment, because the old instinct was to let the easy story take over. It was a story that made sense, where a rancher defends his property and subdues the outlaws before the law arrives to clean it up. It was a story Boone could easily file paperwork around, and it would follow Cole into town and fit perfectly with who people already thought he was. He decided to let that story go. "She held the line," he admitted, "and I was on my knees on that porch with numb hands while she walked out with that blade and took Rook down before I could do a thing about it." Boone stared at him in silence before looking toward the kitchen door where Riko had appeared with a tray and 2 cups. She set the tray on the rail without looking at either of them and went back inside. Boone watched her go and picked up a cup, turning it in his hands like the ceramic might explain the situation if he held it long enough. He whispered a thank you toward the empty doorway, though it felt like he was thanking the furniture. From across the yard, Denny shouted loud enough for both of them to hear him. "I saw her from the bunkhouse, and I'm sitting there bleeding when she comes through that door like something out of a story nobody has written yet." Boone looked at his deputies, and his deputies looked at the fence posts. Since nobody had the right words for what they were seeing, they all stayed quiet and started loading Rook and his men into the wagon. By early afternoon, the yard was empty again, and the burned curtains had been taken down. Cole had nailed a board over the broken window himself, working one-handed because his right hand still wasn't fully cooperating. Denny was asleep in the bunkhouse, and the quiet that settled over the ranch felt different than the silence before the raid. It wasn't the absence of something about to happen, but rather the stillness that follows something that already has. Cole sat with Riko on the porch steps as the light turned long and orange across the scrub land. He didn't ask her where she learned to use the katana, but instead asked her what it actually meant to carry it. She turned the question over in her mind before answering. "It isn't about glory," she said, "but you carry it because your father carried it, and because someone has to. Because putting it down would mean everything it cost him was for nothing." Cole was quiet for a long while as a hawk moved across the far edge of the sky and disappeared behind the ridge. "My wife ran this ranch for 2 years while I was grieving," he said. "And she fed the cattle and kept the accounts and held the whole thing together without once asking me to come back to it." He stopped for a second and added, "I didn't understand what she'd done until she was already gone." It was the first time he had ever said those words out loud to anyone. Cole rode into town 3 days later and headed straight for the land registry office before he did anything else. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man named Aldous, who wore his authority in a stiff celluloid collar and kept his record books in a system only he fully understood. When Cole told him what he wanted, Aldous looked up from the ledger slowly, the way a man looks up when he's heard something he wants to make sure he heard right. "Half," Cole said again, making sure the man heard him. "Legal and recorded." Aldous wrote it down without another word. Cole rode home with the paper folded in his breast pocket, having told neither Riko nor Denny about his trip. He knew Denny would have had plenty of opinions on the matter, so he kept it to himself until he walked through the kitchen door. He set his hat on the hook and put the paper on the table in front of her without any preamble. She read it once, then read it again even slower. Her finger moved along the line where her name sat beside his in Aldous' careful clerk's handwriting. Riko Hargrove. 2 words that hadn't existed in any official record anywhere on earth until that morning. She looked up and asked him why. "Because you earned it," Cole said, "and because I need a partner, not a housekeeper." She held the paper flat with both hands and looked at him with the same measuring steadiness she'd turned on every new thing since she'd stepped off that train. It wasn't gratitude exactly, but rather an assessment to see if he truly understood what he'd just done. "You know what this means," she said. "A woman who won't be managed, who follows a code you'll never fully understand, and who carries a blade she expects you to respect." "I understand enough," Cole said. She looked back at the paper while a wind moved through the yard outside. Somewhere past the barn, one of the horses called out and another answered, which were just the ordinary sounds of the place. She folded the paper along its original crease and held it in her hands, and Cole had the impression she was deciding something that had nothing to do with him, something she was working out alone in that private language of her own reasoning. Then she set it on the table between them, which was her version of yes. It was Cole's idea to put the lacquered case on the mantel. He carried it up from her room himself, cleared the center of the shelf above the fireplace, and set it there the way you put something where it can be seen. There was no explanation and no ceremony, just the case sitting above the fire in the middle of the main room. Riko stood in the doorway and watched him do it, but she didn't stop him. A letter arrived from the agency 2 weeks later, a form letter that was polite and procedural. It asked whether the arrangement had proved satisfactory and whether both parties were adjusting to their new circumstances. Cole read it at the table, turned it over, and wrote his reply on the back in one line: "More than I deserved." He folded it, sealed it, and sent it back. That evening Riko walked out to the south fence at dusk, standing at the fence line with her back to the house and looking out toward the ridge where the Cutter gang had first appeared. Cole came and stood beside her, and neither of them talked while the sky went red along the bottom and then purple above it. Through the window behind them, the lacquered case sat on the mantel in the firelight, visible to anyone who walked through the door. It was explained to no one, but it belonged to both of them now. Cole never asked her to be less than she was, and it took 6 men and a raid at dawn to teach him that lesson. The case sits on the mantel where anyone can see it, and nobody in Dust Creek asks about it twice. What it costs to carry someone else's honor into a world that doesn't have a word for it is a question that never really goes away. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe. There are more people like Riko out here, one's history almost forgot, and they're just waiting to be told right.